The sharp rap of knuckles hammered against my front door like a relentless drumbeat. I placed my steaming coffee mug on the counter and headed toward the entryway, already bracing for trouble rather than a welcome wagon bearing baked goods. Peering through the peephole, I spotted a woman in her mid-50s gripping a clipboard as if it held state secrets. Her expression was locked in what could only be called self-righteous indignation. I cracked the door open just enough to converse. She launched in immediately, her voice laced with accusation. "I know exactly what you're doing here, and it stops today." Her name tag proclaimed Margaret Thornberry, HOA president, and she brandished that position like a knight wielding a broadsword. "Can I help you?" I asked, maintaining a calm tone. Even as amusement threatened to bubble up at her dramatic posture, she responded with thinly veiled fury. "Don't play dumb with me. This property has been vacant for 6 months. You can't just break in and squat here. I've already called the police." I lifted an eyebrow. "Ma'am, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. Save it for the authorities," she cut in, pointing her pen at me like a dagger. "I have photographic evidence of you trespassing." The Maplewood Estates HOA has zero tolerance for criminals. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, and Margaret's face glowed with triumphant malice. A sheriff's vehicle swung into my driveway, and Deputy Martinez emerged, a familiar face from my days at the courthouse. "Your Honor," Deputy Martinez said with clear surprise and deference, touching the brim of his hat. "I didn't know you'd moved into the neighborhood. Everything all right here?" Margaret's clipboard slid from her grasp and clanged against the porch. Her mouth gapped open and shut like a stranded fish. "Why, Your Honor," she stuttered. "I suppose I should explain how I ended up in this predicament. 3 weeks earlier, inherited this vacation home from my late Aunt Eleanor. After 2 decades practicing law and my recent appointment as a circuit court judge, I craved escape from the city's relentless demands. The plan was straightforward. Take a 6-month sabbatical, savor some tranquility, and perhaps finally write that legal thriller I've been mentally drafting for years. Maplewood Estates seemed ideal, a gated community 45 minutes from downtown, nestled among towering oaks and wrapped in blissful quiet. I deliberately flown under the radar, stashing my unassuming sedan in the garage and skipping the neighborhood events. After years under public scrutiny, the gift of anonymity felt too precious to relinquish. What I hadn't anticipated was Margaret Thornberry, whose grip on the HOA seemed to demand intimate knowledge of every resident's personal details, down to their breakfast preferences. As I would later discover, she governed the association like her own private fiefdom, where grass blades were mandated at precisely 2.5 inches, and trash cans left out a minute too soon earned formal citations. The trouble began when I neglected to file my HOA registration forms. In my defense, I was still navigating my aunt's estate and acclimating to suburban rhythms. But in Margaret's realm, this omission equated to an act of outright rebellion against decency. She first spotted my car during one of her routine community wellness checks, a phrase neighbors later translated as nosy patrols. My out-of-state plates and tinted windows evidently signaled nefarious intent to her overactive suspicions. She began chronicling my activities with the zeal of a nature documentarian tracking rare wildlife. On day 1, she snapped photos of my vehicle from half a dozen angles. By day 3, my security camera captured her pressing her face to my dining room window, though she later insisted she was merely inspecting for break-in evidence. Within the first week, she assembled a binder labeled Evidence of Illegal Occupation at 427 Oak Ridge Drive, complete with color-coded sections and a detailed index. She confided to her loyal follower, Janet Morris, with hushed excitement. "That man arrives at odd hours, never attends HOA meetings, and I've never seen him receive mail." Classic squatter behavior. Janet, whom I later learned was a retired librarian, with abundant free time and minimal doubt, enthusiastically enlisted in the cause. Together, they enlisted other residents into their neighborhood watch network, weaving narratives of dangerous intruders threatening their serene enclave. "We must protect our property values," Margaret proclaimed at an emergency HOA meeting one I naturally wasn't invited to. "This squatter could be running drugs, planning burglaries, or worse, lowering our community standards. The irony, naturally, was that my evenings were spent reviewing case precedents and streaming courtroom dramas while enjoying takeout pad thai. My boldest transgression was occasionally parking at a slight angle in my own driveway. Margaret's suspicions escalated when she learned I'd had furniture delivered. She announced with alarm to anyone within earshot, "He's not just squatting, he's moving in permanently. We need to act before he claims squatters' rights." She submitted a formal complaint to the HOA board, which she conveniently chaired, and pushed for legal measures. The vote was unanimous, largely because dissenting voices were either too frightened to speak up or fully convinced by her fabricated emergency. Then came the showdown that would go down as Maplewood Estates folklore. Margaret orchestrated what she dubbed a citizen's intervention, rounding up Janet and 3 other neighbors to march on my doorstep that Saturday morning, phones recording and emergency services on standby. I opened the door dressed for a lazy weekend, faded jeans and an ancient law school tee, which Margaret would later brand as the attire of a career drifter. She stepped forward like a TV detective delivering the big reveal. "Sir, you are illegally occupying these premises. I demand you provide proof of ownership or vacate immediately." "Ma'am," I replied evenly, "I'm not required to show you anything. This is private property." My refusal to hand over papers pushed her into high gear. Her voice rose sharply. "That's exactly what a criminal would say. I knew the previous owner, Eleanor Hartman, and she would never rent to someone like you." "Someone like me?" I asked, intrigued by the leap her mind had taken. "Someone who sneaks around, refuses to join community events, and probably doesn't even have a legitimate job," she snapped. I came close to informing her that Eleanor had been my aunt, and that my so-called non-existent career involved sentencing people to lengthy prison terms. Instead, I kept it simple: "Have a nice day," and shut the door. That was the moment she dialed the police, alleging I'd threatened her, a total invention that would eventually backfire spectacularly. The true spectacle unfolded 2 weeks later when Margaret, infuriated by law enforcement's unwillingness to haul me away on her say-so alone, escalated to a civil suit. She petitioned for an emergency injunction to evict me from the neighborhood, and sought $50,000 in damages for emotional distress and diminished property values. Her lawyer, evidently operating on contingency and swayed by her unshakable certainty, skipped even rudimentary checks. No property record search, no identity verification, and definitely no quick online lookup of Judge William Chan, which could have spared everyone considerable humiliation. The case landed in my own courthouse. The universe clearly had a sense of humor. My friend Judge Patricia Williams was originally scheduled to preside, but she was away at a judicial conference. The substitute, me, returning from sabbatical a few days ahead of schedule, eased the docket backlog. I could have recused myself. In hindsight, I probably should have. But after 3 weeks of being hounded for simply living in my inherited house, Margaret had turned it personal. Where was the satisfaction in stepping aside? The courtroom was filled to capacity that Thursday morning. Margaret had mobilized her allies, all anticipating the triumphant takedown of the menacing intruder. She occupied the plaintiff's table in her sharpest power suit, exuding confidence like heat from a furnace. Her attorney opened with a dramatic flourish. "Your Honor, we are here today to confront a serious threat to the safety and integrity of Maplewood Estates. The defendant has unlawfully occupied." "Counselor," I interjected from behind the folder I was ostensibly studying, "has your client confirmed ownership of the property at issue?" "Well, Your Honor, the defendant has declined to produce any documentation." "That's not my question. Has your client performed a title search, reviewed public records, conducted any real investigation beyond surveillance and conjecture?" Margaret's lawyer fidgeted. "My client possesses substantial photographic proof of questionable activity." "Photographs of someone's vehicle constitute evidence of questionable activity," I remarked flatly. "All right, but not the defendant's." Margaret could no longer stay silent. She rose abruptly. "Your Honor, I know what I witnessed. This man is an imposter. He's likely unemployed. I demand justice." I gradually lowered the folder and met her gaze directly. Recognition hit her like a wave. Color fled her cheeks, her lips parted, but nothing came out. "Mrs. Thornberry," I said, with measured judicial composure that masked my private gratification, "would you like to explain to the court why you've devoted the past 3 weeks to stalking, harassing, and slandering a sitting circuit court judge?" Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Margaret's attorney appeared ready to vanish into the woodwork. Margaret steadied herself against the table, unsteady. "I didn't, Your Honor. I had no idea," she faltered. "Ignorance does not excuse harassment, false police reports, or defamation," I proceeded. "You never inquired about my name, never introduced yourself as a neighbor, never offered the simple courtesy of a discussion before initiating your intimidation campaign." Her counsel attempted damage control. "Your Honor, perhaps we might consider dismissal." "We're far beyond dismissal," I stated. "Mrs. Thornberry lodged a false report claiming I threatened her. She's circulated flyers featuring my photograph, labeling me a criminal. She's trespassed on my property multiple times. And now she's squandered this court's resources with a baseless action rooted solely in her biases and fears." I addressed the clerk. "Please enter into the record that I am filing counterclaims for harassment, defamation, trespassing, and submitting a false police report. I am further referring this matter to the State Bar for examination of counsel's neglect in basic due diligence." The attorney blanched. "Your Honor, certainly we can." "In addition," I pressed on, "I am directing Mrs. Thornberry to cover all court costs, my legal fees. Yes, I will retain counsel for the countersuit and $10,000 in punitive damages to be contributed to the local Fair Housing Alliance." 10,000. Margaret shrieked, her facade crumbling entirely. "Would you rather we explore criminal prosecution for the false report?" I inquired. "That offense carries potential incarceration of up to 6 months, plus further penalties." She sank into her seat, face etched with dread as the consequences crystallized. Her lawyer leaned in, murmuring frantically, likely plotting his swift exit from representation. "Court is adjourned," I declared, striking the gavel with slightly extra emphasis. As the bailiff guided a dazed Margaret from the room, I overheard her hushed plea to her attorney. "How much is this going to cost me?" "With the countersuit, fees, and damages," he answered somberly, "likely around 30,000, and that's assuming no criminal charges." Margaret emitted a sound halfway between a sob and a gasp as the weight settled. 3 weeks of relentless pursuit had just evaporated a year's worth of income, and her standing in the community lay in ruins.